How do you facilitate dialogue between people that are trained in different disciplines or that are bringing in stakeholders from civil society to be partners in the research projects? So the multi-stakeholder research project is one that needs to be facilitated. It cannot be assumed, as some authors would imply, that it will just happen. And so we're very fortunate this morning to benefit from the Mr. Urban Futures perspective. Mr. Urban Futures is a substantial research program funded by a number of Swedish institutions in Gothenburg that has been funded since 2009, 2010. So we have a decade of experience on what they call the co-production of knowledge, which is often used as a synonym for transdisciplinary research. And we welcome Kerstin Hemström this morning, who's coming to present. Kerstin and I collaborated in the workshop which was referred to yesterday, held in Gothenburg on the 14th of March on facilitating transdisciplinary research projects. And after her presentation, I'll give the floor to Josefine, who presented the perspective of INTREPID, and she will be making comments on Kerstin's presentation. Kerstin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to talk about Mr. Urban Futures and facilitation. So, unfortunately, I've had a flu, which is not entirely over. So that means two things. I need to look at my papers, sorry for that. And I might need to take some breaks to drink water or whatever, and hopefully won't burst out coughing. So, facilitation at Mr. Urban Futures. This is not an easy topic because this organization is really a network of local research platforms in different cities, which all engage in and organize transdisciplinary research in different ways. And what is facilitation in this context at all? For what, by whom, when, and how? It really depends on how you understand this term, right? And what kind of support you believe the research project needs. Yes?
If I'm behind you.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. That's fine. Oh, sorry, yeah. So I work, at Mr. Urban Futures as an in-house researcher, which is fairly new to the organization. Anyway, so I was first employed at the local platform in Gothenburg and then joined the international secretariat, which keeps it all together, in September last year. Mostly engaged in trying to understand what the research projects affiliated to us do in terms of methods and how they manage this process of transdisciplinary co-production. So whenever that's finished, I'll just introduce you shortly to Mr. Urban Futures. So Mr. Urban Futures is an international research center for sustainable urban development that, like Roderick said, was inaugurated in 2010. And it's made up of a series of local interaction platforms in Sweden, the UK, Kenya, and South Africa, with different local academic and non-academic partners. And then there is an international secretariat in Gothenburg. And the whole thing is really an attempt to form a new type of organization that is oriented towards urban challenges and that responds to these challenges by generating knowledge that is relevant to both research and practice, and that has both local and international relevance. And these platforms are joined together by a shared agenda to realize just cities that are fair, green, and accessible. And they're also joined by transdisciplinary co-production as our approach to knowledge generation. So we use the term transdisciplinary co-production to emphasize that we aim to engage in research that targets real-life problem solving through the combination of scientific perspectives with other ways of knowing from real-world practice, And that to really create usable results that can inform decision-making and really contribute to change, this really needs to be an inclusive and collaborative process in which both researchers and practitioners participate throughout. And at each of these platforms, the partners have been able to create safe spaces for this type of approach. So they've been able to bring down long-standing barriers to collaboration between the local partners and to create trust between partners, so to join forces for sustainable change. So there is some level of enabling or support or facilitation going on at several functional levels here, really, and that has worked out in different ways depending on the local governance arrangements and the context. So all platforms have local research projects, and then there are also some comparator projects that cut across them. And some of them are more strongly tied to certain research traditions within a university setting, and the platform is held together by academic researchers who also participate in and lead transdisciplinary projects. Whereas others, or most distinctively the Gothenburg platform, are tied to a local consortium and held together by local administration. And the research projects are initiated in different ways by different partners, and the researchers that participate in the transdisciplinary research projects come from different departments at the local universities. So the disciplinary environments and the local hosting arrangements vary, as do, of course, the challenges that they face and address. And it's only recently, really, that we started to re-explore this thing about facilitation in our projects. And I say re-explore because in the early days when Merit Polk and others were more heavily involved in the center, they tried to actively support and build co-productive capacity in some ways within the projects. So, for example, there were demands on symmetrical participation between researchers and practitioners or other relevant actors, and shared project leadership between an experienced researcher and an experienced practitioner. And they also held workshops with the project leaders. Now, this changed with time, but Merit and others also wrote this manual on joint knowledge production in 2013, based on the experiences of the center pilot projects, which has been handed out to new project leaders, at least at the Gothenburg platform. And it includes some general recommendations in relation to 3 phases of a transdisciplinary research project, and some examples of methods that could be used in these different phases. And it points to 5 general principles or qualities that need to characterize this process to fulfill the center ambition. So to involve, collaborate, integrate, apply, and reflect. And then there is some, but not much, on what this may demand from leaders and participants in terms of capacities or skills. And since then, the different platforms within Mr. Urban Futures has gained broad experience on what co-production means and how it works in practice. And there are a number of Mr. Urban Futures publications across the different platforms reflecting on the strengths and limits of this approach. And the platforms have also held different training activities. But we also notice in this great participatory turn that we're all in, that there is still confusion out there about what this type of research exactly is and how to go about it. And similarly, we're not clear on how to best support this type of research projects so that they really reach that collaborative and inclusive process and those societally relevant and robust results. And so my first assignment at the platform in Gothenburg was based on an expressed need among the local partners to identify and make available the methods used for transdisciplinary co-production in local projects. So there was a general sense of that we could and should make use of whatever had been done before, so to inform and inspire new project leaders and participants in the research on sustainable urban development. So I went through the documentations from the Finnish projects to understand what they were about and in what way they had managed this process. And then with reference to research on transdisciplinary and co-production research and the type of support or information these projects seem to need, described and introduced the methods that I found useful to show how they may support this process and facilitate co-productive capacity in some way. And based on that, I wrote this report, which in some ways is an updated local version of the manual on joint knowledge production, but reflecting the experiences within the projects in Gothenburg. So summarizing what this approach is about, the challenges it meets at the level of the research projects, things that may be important to safeguard along the way. So for example, to surface different assumptions, recognize power issues, and practice reflexivity. And then examples of project-based methods that have been used to facilitate these interactions between different communities of knowing. And it really is a mixture of some sort of process design and more delimited activities and moments that had significance for the joint process. And this is also in some way about fostering capacity among project leaders and participants so that they can facilitate this process better themselves. Each of the projects in this report, experimented with this process in their own way. And sometimes the things that had significance were planned, and sometimes it was more coincidental. And out of 50 or so projects, I found 2 who consulted a professional facilitator in the process. And I'd like to just briefly let you in on what they did in one of those to show what kind of support the facilitator gave to the process. So the aim of this project was to develop plans for a sustainable hospital area. And the initiators spent quite some time and energy to find and recruit broad expertise and relevant stakeholders to the project. And they ended up with a quite large group of people in which the breadth of expertise was new to everyone involved. So there were several different researchers and many different practitioners with different expertise. So the project leaders set up a project organization and plan in which they formed 8 different types of working and expert groups. So they had separate groups focusing on different functional levels of a sustainable hospital. So they had the infrastructure in the area, the buildings, and the nursing or curative environment. And then separate expert or reference groups that could inform these in terms of social, ecological, and economical sustainability, health promoting services, and collaboration and dialogue. And the initial task of the group focusing on collaboration and dialogue was to support the other groups in their internal group work and also in communicating with others outside of the project. But this group really became key in the whole process. And the group involved 2 persons. So one of them was an appointed process leader of the whole project, an architect specialized in nursing or hospital design, so very much involved in the whole what and why of the project. And the other, an experienced and skilled facilitator, so specialized in the how when it comes to collaboration. And these 2 introduced something they called a draft, wind blowing through something, as a method of working within the projects. And these were basically workshops where participants from these different working groups met, and where the focus was on promoting participation and dialogue and creativeness within the group. But what happened also was that these meetings kept everyone informed about what went on in the other groups. And so it became an opportunity to reflect upon the work, both individually and as a group. And to help the participants to communicate and to test thoughts and ideas, even if they hadn't finished thinking or weren't really ready to share it to the world, the facilitator introduced the word prototype to help them get over it. And they also used Lego to make things more concrete and to communicate and develop their ideas in a more creative way or playful way. So through these meetings, I think there were only 4 of these drafts held. The participants found more synergies and got more input on their ideas. And one concrete output was that they discovered that the original project organization wasn't really working, and so they redesigned the groups in a way that made them more relevant and fit to their task. And altogether, this of course spurred commitment and enthusiasm for the project work, as they kind of co-created a relevance, and there were learning opportunities for everyone involved. So professional facilitation in combination with a process leader knowledgeable of the substantive theme of the project was a success. At least the project was able to develop plenty of recommendations and a plan for a sustainable hospital area that also involved means of communicating with the community or the receiving end. And I guess it was these kinds of experiences that motivated the former platform leader in Gothenburg to employ a skilled facilitator at the platform. So this is a new role also, which is a bit of an experiment on the role of professional facilitation in all this. Her name is Sofia, and some of you have met her at the workshop we held, together with INTREPID on facilitation of transdisciplinary research. And this was really a first opportunity for these professional facilitators because I should mention Sofia is also part of a network called Go Create, which is a network for peer-to-peer learning among skilled facilitators that is hosted by the platform in Gothenburg. And so this was an opportunity for them to meet researchers involved in facilitating transdisciplinary research and also others involved in this field to explore this thing. So the workshop was on facilitation methods and tools and on facilitator capabilities. And I think it was a very fruitful day that, to me at least, became not so much focused on methods, but more on the skills or more personal capabilities that a skilled facilitator has to offer, and the kind of atmosphere they can create within a group. So at least in the afternoon, when we had a brainstorming exercise on the facilitation capabilities and skills that might feed into a transdisciplinary research process, the type of things that were mentioned most often were agility and creativeness, playfulness, empathy, perspective awareness, self-awareness, and things like being trustworthy and being open and impartial, and contributing with negotiation, conflict management, and also systems perspectives. So there is, I think, a lot to learn and consider here on how to support and facilitate transdisciplinary research. In terms of knowledge or awareness of the many different methods you could use, the perspectives you may need to keep, and the functions you may need to support or be attentive to within the group, not only in relation to the reality-based challenge that you're addressing, but also in relation to the capacities that you may need to build. So clear analogies between the skills of facilitators and what a transdisciplinary process needs. But in the same way that there is no ideal or universal method for transdisciplinary research, or these meetings between different worlds of knowing, skilled facilitation is perhaps not always necessary. Sofia has also approached all of the ongoing projects in Gothenburg to offer her skills. And some of them have been positive, but most of them feel autonomous and would like to manage this on their own. I like this word scaffolding that one could use to describe or think about what kind of functions you may need to support within a group to reach some purpose. And we could talk about specific functions that need support in transdisciplinary research, so things that need to be there for an effective process. And then, based upon an understanding of what the situation needs, you could use passive structures by, for example, carefully considering who you engage, where you meet, or set up principles for meetings or a process. Or you could apply a certain deliberative or participatory method or methodology which may require skilled facilitation. Or you could facilitate actively by monitoring what happens in a group and meet their needs in a more dynamic way. And you could work to build capacity within a group and among leaders so that it facilitates itself. I think there's some certain power in that type of group work as well. And something that we're working on now, based on the report I wrote for the Gothenburg platform, is a new version of the manual on knowledge co-production, in which we bring in reflections, recommendations, and method descriptions for transdisciplinary co-production from all of Mr. Urban Future's platforms. And again, rather than methods to address particular urban challenges, the focus is on how to safeguard this joint process. And in this manual, we will discuss professional facilitation as an option when we sketch out the overall process and different methodological and philosophical underpinnings that we would like to share and what it is to lead transdisciplinary research projects. But there won't be many facilitation elements other than those of the action researchers in Sheffield, Manchester, who in their research activities facilitate the engagement of community members. In other places, they mostly manage these processes without calling it facilitation. But of course, still acknowledging that it's not only about applying a certain method or tool, but also about perspectives, values, reflexivity, and these kinds of things. So there will be many examples of methods used to facilitate different functions in the overall process from our context and through the way Mr. Urban Futures and the platforms are set up. So to enable participation, to create boundary spaces, and to facilitate these mutual understandings and the integration of different perspectives, and to somehow create new visionaries and pathways. And this will hopefully not only contribute to learning between our platforms and our thinking on how to support or facilitate transdisciplinary co-production, but also hopefully inform and inspire new project leaders and participants, and perhaps also facilitators in the research for sustainable urban development. So, thank you.
I now give the floor to Josefine.
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side for this very comprehensive and dense presentation, I think, of some of the excellent work you've been doing at Mr. Urban Futures. My name is Josefine Fokdal. I'm based at the Institute of International Urbanism at the University of Stuttgart. I've also had the opportunity to participate within the INTREPID network for the last 4 years, which I have enjoyed very much. I was really excited to meet Kerstin for the first time 2 weeks ago and to see some of the work she has been doing at the Mr. Urban Future platform, because some of you who are sitting here in the room might recognize a similar approach that we have taken within INTREPID. So within the working group 3, focusing on enabling conditions for urban research, urban TD and ID research, we have vanished on the journey for collecting case studies. At the moment we have 10 or 11 specific case studies from various different European countries that we have analyzed, similar to what you have done basically in terms of enabling conditions for ID and TD. And we are not yet fully done with this work. We're still trying to consolidate what are the enabling conditions. You have now put up here 4 conditions that you think are quite helpful, like creating a common language, for example, which I think is also well discussed within the literature and something we have struggled with in practice within INTREPID as well. And I found this recognition of seeing that someone else is doing similar things quite helpful because I think the journey within INTREPID has been very inspiring and very fruitful, but I also think it has been quite frustrating at certain points, maybe trying to break new ground, trying to see how we could develop toolkits for facilitation or for TD processes, for ID processes, all of us doing TD and ID on various different levels, which is also the case, I think, to a certain extent to Mr. Open Futures, that all the different platforms or cases are set up in slightly different ways. All our cases are set up in different ways. They were funded by different funding institutions. They were carried out in different constellations. They were carried out with more participatory approaches, with less participatory approaches. Some were only ID, some were TD. So there are various different versions of understanding where we are in the moment. On top of that, we had a layer of cultural diversity within the INTREPID network, and you also have that within Mr. Open Futures because you have the 4 different countries that you're working in, and I think that adds to the complexity of what we're talking about. So not just in terms of the interactions that you might be able to have at the practical level and or within the research field that you're navigating within, but also in terms of where are the discourses in that country. I know there is a huge discrepancy between where the discourse on TD and ID is in Portugal versus where the discourse is in Sweden or in the Netherlands, for example. We have traveled with INTREPID and we have seen various different levels of engagements by different actors, funding institutes that are willing to recognize the challenge of funding TD projects, but also funding institutes that write that they do ID, but they do not necessarily provide the fruitful ground for doing it at the end, as was also mentioned this morning by Katrin, for example. So I think on top of that complexity, we have this cultural layer, which is quite interesting. So out of those 10 projects that we have looked at within INTREPID, we also had 1 or 2 projects that actually had professional facilitators that were consulted. It was either implemented within the project or they were consulted to come in as externals to guide the TD process. And as a reflection upon what we saw in these case studies, it led us to think what kind of tools and capacity buildings does it actually require? So similar to what you've actually done in your case. And once we got through to that point, looking at the tools, at the enabling conditions that we have all created in our different small processes that we had been within, we realized that it's nice to have these tools, and I wish that your toolbox would be in English also. That would be really nice. But we also need to know how to apply these tools, and that was also a question that we had back in Gothenburg. It's nice to have a toolbox, but if you don't know how and when to apply these things, it's not much worth, basically, which of course calls for the need for facilitators who are trained and who knows how to deal with these things. And again, also here, I think within Germany, the recognition that you need facilitators is relatively young. I'm looking at Hendrik, but I would say we just had 4 or 5 years of funding of transdisciplinary research projects where there is a recognition that it's needed, but still there is a strong need to push that further, I think. Yes, so that is just to say that this discourse on needing facilitators is also very diverse, depending on where you look within Europe. And I think Sweden, and the case you showed today within Mr. Urban Futures, is one of the prime examples of how helpful it can be to have facilitators, and that it's really recognized as a helpful role within a TD process to be filled. Of course, recognizing that there is a need for facilitators call for the question of what kind of skills and capacities do these facilitators actually need. We worked on that in Gothenburg 2 weeks ago. A couple of these skills were mentioned by you, so empathy, creativity, self-awareness. I think these are all quite helpful and useful in terms of training facilitators. And of course, that is the big question. Do we need to teach these skills now to the future facilitators, to the future researchers that we teach within our respective programs of bachelor's and master students also? And I'm coming from the urban field. There's a long tradition of participatory research, for example, yet it's something different to be able to facilitate a TD process, I think. And I really liked the fact that you mentioned conflict management, for example. I think this is one of the core points that we need to integrate into our curricula. And I'm bringing this discussion towards what we'll be talking about tomorrow also, because curricular development is a huge issue. And of course, one can talk about facilitation on different levels, but I think that many of us who are sitting here do research and at the same time teach. And in order to also prepare the next generation of researchers to do TD, I think that's quite crucial. And it would be interesting to know whether anyone in the room have a module such as conflict management integrated into the programs that they teach. You have. I also have. Okay, a couple of people. That's nice. And I think this is maybe something that we need to push a bit further to think about is not just conflict management. Are there further skills that are needed? How can we foster the creativity that is needed, for example, in the facilitation process? How can we teach the future generation to deal with the tools, the toolkits that you're developing, that we are developing in one way or another? How to know when to apply which one? This kind of intuition that needs to be developed for facilitating these processes. So it's a really difficult question, I think, and I don't have the answer for how to actually teach that and which skill you really need for doing this. But I think that's quite a crucial point. So that's one thing I picked up from your presentation. I think we need to discuss what kind of implications does the recognition of the role as a facilitator within TD processes have for education and for the future generation of researchers that we have. I also think it would be nice to discuss what kind of implication does it have for funding structures. Obviously, if we recognize that there is a need for facilitators within TD research processes, we also need to be able to pay these people somehow. And funding structures need to recognize it as well, that there is a need for facilitators, so we can apply for this role to be incorporated. And at least to my mind, that there's still a far way to go in the environment I work in. I think it's slowly coming that, at least within Germany, Sweden is a good example, but there are other countries, I think, where it's not at all a topic. You can't apply for funding to have a facilitator within a TD process. So I think that's a big issue, and I think we should try to get some of the findings we have within INTREPID out there in terms of policy brief also towards the funding institutions. I know we've lost a bit track of them, but it would be nice if we could manage to do that. And then, of course, I think an issue is also capacity building for researchers. I myself was at the periphery of a TD research process, and I saw the frustration of all the young researchers who were part of the TD process, but were not really trained to be part of a TD process. So they were not trained as facilitators, but they were still pushed into the role as a facilitator because there were no facilitators, basically. They were suddenly wearing multiple hats at the same time. They were the researcher, but they were also the facilitator. They were also the citizen at the same time. And all of these diverse hats that that you're pushed into wear because you're a multidimensional personality, let's say. And I think this is also something that we should be discussing. How can we do capacity building for young researchers who are involved in TD processes? How can we help them when they set up their PhD project within a TD process? Because we are breaking new ground, and at the same time, these young researchers are the ones having to battle for whose knowledge is owned by whom, and all of these questions that are institutional barriers, I think, and academic barriers, mental barriers towards TD processes, towards facilitating a fruitful environment for the next generation, doing their PhD, doing their masters within these research projects also. So I think the further implications beyond looking into education is also the capacity building for young researchers to be a young researcher within a TD process, and for funding institutions. What kind of funding schemes do we need to develop in order to be able to include facilitators into this? So I think that's my comment at the moment, and the questions I wanted to raise. I'll give the mic back. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, please stay, Josefine, and Kerstin, please come forward. We open up now for questions and answers from the floor. First of all, let's take some comments or questions on the presentation or the discussant's response before we have a more general discussion. Who would like to begin?
Yes, many thanks for this inspiring presentation and also nice discussion points. One thing that is always a challenge for me, and we have someone here in the room who you can ask, like the students that we educate in transdisciplinary projects, you probably have the same experience. They suffer a lot. And I think it's often a question, as was said, of choice. So for me, this conundrum that we have is that very often we say, for instance, we should be more reflexive. Yes, I haven't come across a convincing argument why we should be less reflexive, you know, but there's a trade-off between all these things that are now also nicely summarized on the wall. So there's always this trade-off, and this is where I see in our groups go like 99% of the discussions. What's your experience in your programs with these trade-offs and how you can maybe orchestrate them or maybe educate people to deal with this?
But to me, reflection and reflexivity is also about being aware of the limits of what you do. So that also includes making conscious decisions about how far you go with these things. And then, I mean, because you can never be all-inclusive, or you could never, or in most cases, not include all the relevant actors that you should include from a sustainability perspective, and etc. And that goes for all of these different things. And power is always present. You won't be able to address all the power issues, or maybe the whole point of the project is not for it to be a democratic where maybe it's not based on democratic ideals, and you don't need to reach consensus, but you need to realize that these things are there. So there's a whole lot to gain from transparency in that way, if that's the right word. That would be my comment, at least.
Yeah, I think it's indeed a point. And then to me, that's many aspects. And one, I think, from our scientific backgrounds, and students are in the scientific realm, deconstruction, so discussing things to their different compartments is something that's very in our doing. So deconstructing also systems knowledge based. So when teaching, when I'm involved in teaching transdisciplinary project management or also facilitation aspects, I always try to get to a point where then it comes to reconstruction. And that means on other terms also coming always to a part where you also look at the target and transformation knowledge for your situation you're in. So focusing not only on looking on all that, and that's also something Catherine mentioned with this one nice sentence that we might have focused too much on just all these different challenges. It's this deconstructive way in looking all that, well, there's so much around, and probably forgetting about discussing and where we want to go and how we could get there despite some, well, it's not easy to come here through, but I don't have to solve all these walls. I don't have to go up these walls. So working on doable ways, and so for me it's often going towards training more than seminar styles of training.
Yeah, and this to me also relates to the points you pointed out with the cultural differences or the different contexts, and that, I mean, you might be able to reach differently far, if that's a concept, in different concepts depending on what the challenges are or what the institutional circumstances are, etc. So, for example, the projects we have in Kisumu are very different from the ones in Gothenburg because of a number of reasons, but because obviously many of the challenges require more immediate actions, and so they face another set of challenges where when they work with community members to try to develop a solution, they instantly adopt it, although they're not ready with it, and that challenges the whole research process in a different way than the practitioners challenge things in the Gothenburg context. So, yeah. So there are different limits and different. You have to adjust the things you want to achieve to the context, and you're still doing something good, hopefully, for sustainability. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that brings up another issue that is also quite interesting, the transferability of these things that we teach and do, basically. In the programs I teach, we have a lot of people from the Global South, and it's very much about how to transfer the type of conflict management, for example, you have been taught within the program to a context in Kenya or South Africa or wherever, you know. And I think it's quite underestimated what kind of pressure there is on decontextualizing and contextualizing at the same time for these individuals. Because, I mean, you're probably aware of this whole discourse around SDGs and the New Urban Agenda and the pressure put on individuals as change agents by the UN. And many of us educate these future change agents because we strive towards sustainability in one way or another, and we use TD processes to a certain extent also along that line of argumentation for transformative processes. And I think it's quite an understood part of what people are faced with once they return to a different context or to a well-known context, but from being contextualizing back to their own context and transferring the knowledge they have gained basically as facilitators or moderators, conflict managers, the institutional barriers they're confronted with, and the multi-stakeholder environment they are within. So I think it's quite an interesting issue that we should also keep in mind when we talk about our role of educating the next generation, basically.
The question, do you also take this as a research topic to compare the different contexts of implementation? Is that part of your research?
Well, it could be, but it's a matter of time also. We're in our final year of funding at Mr. Urban Futures, so there are many different activities now to get more funding. And in some of the projects that we will try to get funding for will be to look more on drawing upon the comparative things within Mr. Urban Futures on several different levels. So both substantive topics and in terms of processes and methods. But there was something else I was thinking about when you asked that question, which I completely forgot now.
Just finished a research project from Swiss National Science Foundation where we tried to look at what do people transfer, people as researchers and stakeholders, from one transdisciplinary project in case A or topic A to the other one in case 2 or topic 2. And our thinking was, and the thinking behind was basically, we have to come up with something that replaces the double-blind whatever test, you know. It's different in transdisciplinarity. So we thought that people have to reflect a lot on the changing conditions between topics and cases. That was our thinking, so all our analysis was on that kind of direction. And then what we found was that they very rarely transferred content things, but mostly process things, methods. Henrik will be happy. Methods and the TD approach in general, and how to do a policy brief. So they do completely different things, what they basically transfer. I think that's the main outcome that we have. So all this kind of reflect, and they usually don't reflect anything. You know, if you ask them, and these were kind of, I mean, these were Swiss researchers, it might be different in other countries. But my question was about the thin line between, as you said, the change agent and the facilitator. You know, did you have any kind, in Gothenburg or wherever, any kind of discussion about that thin line? And I asked that because I had a rather big discussion once with a colleague from Bern who basically said, I'm only the facilitator. And I said, no, I have also to make sure that at the end it's something like sustainable development, however we define that. And he in a way said, no, I trust in the process. The process will always come up with the sustainable solution. And I said, no, we have to reflect on that, whether that's sustainable or not. So what are your, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I took a crash course on facilitation in Sweden last year. And the way professional facilitators do there, they very clearly separate between the why of facilitating workshop or whatever and the how. So the responsibility of the facilitator is only to manage the how, and it's based on some kind of contract with someone who manages the why and what. But yeah, so I don't have an answer to the thin line, but I have, you know, I think there are plenty of things to think about and further discuss here. But I also had this conversation with one of the other presenters at the workshop we had with INTREPID 2 weeks ago. And he is a very experienced facilitator who uses the inquiry-based approach. And he's also a researcher. But he never facilitates the projects in which he is a researcher himself, because there is a clear, there are difficulties with discursive power and wanting to, yeah, as a facilitator you need to kind of step back from what you want yourself and be very attentive to listen to the other ones and give room for everyone involved. So there is a problem with being part of the project as a knowledge holder and managing the how at the same time. But I think sometimes probably it works and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, maybe someone else, because I don't actually facilitate myself, my research. So yeah.
Paper together in university
that you can just collaborate, and then one student just takes over the facilitation of their small meeting for 2 hours. So there's just lots of different modes of facilitation. It's endless. And I think, in my experience, facilitation is not easy. And I say it's an art. It's like you somehow have to adapt to the context. It's really, that's what made it with me. It's really a personal transformation as well. It's like it's able to be seeing people, making our voices heard, really trying to plan in a way that the engagement is enlightening in a way that people really connect. So there's lots of different things I could comment on, but I think it's really interesting that what I felt when I studied TD at Leuphana, and well, we need exactly the practical skills to do so. Okay, now I know the theory, but how do I do it if I sit there with a group and to facilitate the process doesn't go on? So I think that's how I came in my job of facilitating these engagements where it's really on the personal note, like how do we connect each other?
How do you link this to facilitation?
Huh?
How do you link this kind of exercise that you're doing as we talk to facilitation? Do you see it as a...
Yeah, I could talk for long on that, but I don't want to take up too much room. There is a distinction between graphic recording, which is live capture, and graphic facilitation. If I'm graphically facilitating, I'm part of the process. And if I'm graphic recording, I'm just like capturing the essence, but there's boundaries in this discussion as well.
This also very nicely illustrates that different facilitators use also different theories of change. So they have different understandings of what the situation needs.
Communication between the design sciences and the social sciences. Is there any particular, do you have any experience of that kind of facilitation, and anything that you want to say about that?
Well, not specifically. And in that project, there were design researchers and social researchers, but there were also loads of practitioners who don't really care about the disciplinary background, or they work in all these different fields in different ways. And so, you know, the things they did worked to facilitate communication among all these actors, and not just specifically looking at the different disciplines. I mean, based on some experience from other projects, I think there is a strength of having very disparate disciplinary perspectives in the same projects, because that's also really when you can contest, or you need to meet very different, deeply rooted assumptions about epistemology and these things, or truth, or what kind of results are we aiming for here. So I think it's a strength to have several disciplines rather than one. And when you have one, I think there also maybe a bit larger of a risk that the researcher somehow gains discursive power, because it is difficult to be aware of the position you take yourself and the things you bring into the table. And you also realize in many situations when you work closely with practitioners that they also have certain expectations on you as a researcher. So even if you try to take a very open-minded and neutral stance yourself, then it may be challenging on their part. So that would be my answer.
When bringing it back to facilitation, brings it also back to how can we teach, train such things. And I mean, there is a wealth of knowledge and trainings on facilitation, looking at ethics, and also mediation brings a lot on ethics, how you approach different perspectives, how you embrace also. So are you going in neutral, are you trying to embrace all the different people, the mindset you're approaching people? So learning and teaching that, and I think also thinking on when we as researchers go in and facilitate ourselves, are we up to that? And it also depends for me on the situation different perspectives, probably can handle very contested perspectives. When we are part of it, might get difficult, conflicting perspectives. I would say not very advisable to facilitate when being one of the perspectives.
Just say one sentence. So I do think that ethics cannot be taken for granted, although we accept it as a norm.
And then in response to what Christian said on what they have done. So at Mr. Urban Futures, we've actually focused on keeping comparative perspectives with respect to substantive issues in these projects. So that has been where our main focus has been. And in making this manual, which involves a long list of contributing authors from the different platforms, this is really an exercise for many of them to think about the process and the methods in this way. So they haven't actually, many of them haven't reflected upon this in this way. So for us, this is a big learning opportunity, and through making this manual, this is when we really, you've used similar things, or we do it with a twist, somewhat similar description in our context, etc., across these different scales of north, south, etc. So I think, and there is a lot of opportunity there to reach some kind of more global knowledge on things that work across context as well. But it's work in progress. So.
I think we draw the morning session to a close. I thank Kerstin and Josefine, who had her obligations as a devoted mother. And I just wanted to close this morning's session and thanking you for your comments and your participation. Some take-home messages. From Catherine's this morning, I was really struck by the loud and the soft voices. And I think what's really important from your message to us this morning is not only the differences between those voices and the value systems they express, but they're still not talking to each other. That's the critical point.
I just want to make sure that we credit Katrine Lindvig with the loud and soft voices. I am just exploiting her ideas mercilessly. And for those of you who are going to join us at the ITD conference in Gothenburg, I hope she's going to have an opportunity to speak herself about this issue.
Right. And her work was part of a doctoral dissertation in Copenhagen, right? Yeah. The second take-home message is that we've addressed the temporal perspective, the time dimension. And again, it came first in Catherine's discussion when she talked about slow research. And the only thing I was a little worried about, where I don't agree with you, is that I don't think interdisciplinary research is automatically slow research. And I think you showed that when you talked about, I think the individual researcher who is an interdisciplinary scholar can be a slow researcher. But from my own experience working in EU FP5, FP7 projects with what you call the disciplinary experts working in work package, I wouldn't say teams, that's all about fast research. And I think you talked about the culture of speed. I think we also have to add the culture of publish or perish. And I think we've got a real big problem there as a handicap to the academic system, which is valuing, the publication in a ranked journal rather than the other dimensions that we've been talking about for 4 years in INTREPID. And then the last point comes to the session we've just had in this distinction between the facilitator and the researcher. And I think it's absolutely fascinating to see whether people want to wear two hats or whether we want to separate these functions and what we want to attribute to each of them. And so we come back to the question of the how, and Kerstin said the why, and we could add the what. And on that particular note, I think I'm closing the session, thanking you for your participation. We meet back here at 2:30 for the afternoon sessions that will be chaired by Catherine. Bon appétit.